You're listening to Let's Talk. Let's Talk is a digital space for students at PCC experiencing disabilities to share their perspectives, ideas, and worldviews in an inclusive and accessible environment. The views and opinions expressed in this program or those of the speakers do not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of Portland Community College, KCC Foundation, or X-Ray FM. We broadcast bi-weekly on our home website, pcc.edu/DCA, on Spotify, and on X-Ray 91.1 FM and 107.1 FM.
Hello, my name is Amanda, and I'm a disability advocate for PCC specializing in autism. The Let's Talk Autism series focuses on different issues surrounding the autism community and how the general public interacts with us. On today's Let's Talk Autism podcast, it continues the discussion of autism versus ADHD in women and people raised as women. I was joined by Mackenzie, who is hard of hearing and gave a very interesting perspective of this condition and how it interacts with their autism and ADHD. I will say that I personally felt humbled and awed by Mackenzie's story because not only do they have to with everyday struggles of autism and ADHD, but they also have to accommodate literally everyone they talk to. I hope you gained as much appreciation as I did on this episode.
My name's Mackenzie. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a ASL English interpreting student. I'm in the interpreter program, and I'm doing a minor in Deaf Cultural Studies certificate. I am mostly a student. I work also as a PCC disability advocate, but because of my disabilities, I often don't have the time or energy to log those hours, so I haven't been as engaging as I've wanted to be. But outside of that, previously, my occupation for a long time was in food service. Did a lot of cooking, managerial work, front of house. I did kind of everything and decided that was too much for my body and not sustainable. So when COVID had me without a job for about a year or 2 years, I decided to go back to school and pursue my goal that I started about a decade ago, but wasn't able to complete. Actually, when I did go to school 10 years ago, when I was 18, 19, that's when I received my ADHD diagnosis initially. I had seen a counselor at University of Oregon, and I had been struggling with my mental health for pretty much since I was like 12 or 13. I had seen a lot of doctors, given on a lot of different diagnoses, and when I was seeing this counselor at University of Oregon, she was like, I think you have ADHD. She also had ADHD and had been diagnosed around college age. And I got mad and I didn't go back to see her because I was like, everybody's just trying to give me a different diagnosis. It's just all so confusing. I don't know what to believe. But then after doing some research, I was like, you know what? I think it would be worth it to have this discussion. So I went back to see her, and then she had me referred to a diagnosing person, and they diagnosed me officially with ADHD, which they group all into one. These days, there's not really ADD, ADHD. It's all ADHD and then different types. And I think the type that I was diagnosed with was the inattentive type. And so I think ever since then, I have been trying to grasp still. I've seen so many different doctors, therapists, been on a lot of medications, and still really struggle with my mental health. And about a year ago, I have been seeing a lot more information online, like social media, about autism, and remembering a time in high school when I had considered if that was maybe a piece of my picture. And I brought it up to my therapist at the time about a year ago, and she was like, oh, I thought you had already been diagnosed. And I was like, no, I haven't. And then I brought it up to my main doctor that I've been working with for the past almost year. And she was like, I really do think this could be, something that is a part of you based on your growing up and all the like chronic health stuff that I've dealt with. A lot of times she explained it to me like people on the spectrum, there's like a lot of typicals, right? It's the three chronic conditions in gut, brain, and inflammation, a lot of trouble regulating my nervous system, and also identifying as non-binary. That's pretty common for people on the spectrum. So I haven't received an official diagnosis. I've hit a lot of barriers in trying to do that. But recently my doctor was like, I think we can just incorporate this as part of your health and like your treatment plan, because I do think that it is definitely a consideration. And so, yeah, that's my story.
Thank you very much. How would you describe your autism and ADHD in your own words?
I don't know how to describe it. And I think that's part of the autism and ADHD is always had trouble articulating how I feel or like even being able to recognize how I feel. A lot of my work in the last decade has been in trying to do that and to feel my feelings and not black out and dissociate. And yeah, it's just basically, I feel like if I could describe it in a couple words, it's very overwhelming. Like I feel constantly overwhelmed, overstimulated, hard to make decisions, a lot of anxiety and stress leading to shutdowns, just having to escape and not really knowing why it's so hard for me to engage in the modern world and why it's so hard to just like seemingly do everything else that I'm supposed to be able to do or know that I'm capable of. Like people will tell me all the time, you're so intelligent. I know, but I just feel like I need so much like support and help that I don't know what it is or how to ask for it. I heard someone describe it as there's someone living inside of me. Right? There's this person inside of me, and then there's this high masking person that has learned to be that way because of survival and growing up and not knowing how to let this inner piece of me out. So yeah, I guess that's how I would describe it.
Thank you. For my autism, the way I would describe it is, this might sound a bit weird, but almost like utter detachment. I'm not as emotional when I look at situations, so I'm able to really just disengage and just go through the motions and just get stuff done because I need a lot of stimulation to keep my focus. Like that's the issue with me. Like I can actually take a lot of stimulation, I feel like, compared to a lot of autistic people, and that's not like a slight against you, and I apologize if that sounds like that. But the problem is with that is I get bored so easily. Say I'm in a group like of 4 people or more. If the conversation just shifts to something I don't know or they're not talking to me even for a couple of minutes, I'm not offended. I just go off and do something else because what's the point of me being there? Mm-hmm. And they take it as, oh my God, are we offending you? Did we leave you out? And I'm like, no, you're good. I'm bored. And that somehow makes it worse. Apparently, neurotypical people do not like the honesty bit.
It's true. Yeah, I can relate to a lot of what you said too, because while I do get overstimulated a lot, I do need a lot of stimulation, dopamine to be able to focus and do things.
So what exactly led to your ADHD diagnosis from your college advisor or counselor? Basically, someone noticed ADHD in you. What symptoms did they see in you, and what led you to agree with them later on? Because it sounds like when they first brought it up with you, you weren't very happy with them because you just got a bunch of different contradictions from different professionals, which I get the frustration a lot. What symptoms did she see in you, and what made you go back to her?
That's a good question, and one that I don't know if I'll be able to answer. I guess it was just in my experience with like my mental health struggles. It's just very intense, like depression, anxiety, like stuff that I just, no matter what I tried, I could not like let go of. Inability to focus, like I mentioned, just feeling overwhelmed and not necessarily knowing what to do. I honestly think she probably just related her own experience a lot to my experience. I felt that way when I went off to college or whatever, and then someone pointed out that I might have ADHD, so I got tested. And back then, I don't even know if I did a ton of research. I probably just Googled typical symptoms in ADHD, but I remember going through and be like, yep, to like all of them. Yeah, and the process I went through to get diagnosed was pretty in-depth, so I felt pretty confident about that. They talked to your parents, and it's a couple different sessions. It was like sitting and chatting, and then there was doing some like intellectual testing. I am so curious about like the lens the diagnoser used back then. Did they consider autism and other conditions like that? Or did they only look at ADHD and that's all? And that, I don't know, I can't answer, but it would make a lot of sense if diagnosing people had this way to look at someone holistically. That's how I believe most of healthcare should work, and just be like, I'm going to evaluate you for all these things and see what fits best. Because while to some degree having a diagnosis does nothing mean nothing, but it also does mean a lot, right? Because it means you can name and identify this thing, but it's not always right either. And like how you interact and participate in those evaluations is very dependent on how you present, right? And so I think that can lead to a lot of barriers when you are always presenting a certain persona to people versus how you actually feel inside. I've noticed I've always done that since I was a kid. From a very young age, I started doing that. I remember being 3 and just being very aware of how people wanted me to be versus how I felt that I should act. And I think that just led to a lot of, I don't know myself well, I can't make decisions, and anxiety and stress and stuff like that.
Based on what you said, what would you say are your most prominent ADHD symptoms? And even if you're not officially diagnosed with autism, what would you say are your most prominent autism symptoms? And would you say that they match pretty stereotypically with what people consider ADHD and autism? Obviously, you're not a boy, but I feel like that's like the main stereotype people do have about both conditions.
Yeah, I was having trouble figuring out what that would be because to some degree, the things that I think are the most prominent symptoms are not necessarily the stereotypical ones. I was talking about this with my therapist recently about just masking people, not knowing what unmasking even looks like because they've been doing it for so long. So that is definitely a piece too. I don't know. Like when I am alone, I think I do behave a lot differently than when I'm with other people, but it's not often that I let that happen too. So in response to the thing about the boy, I'll say an interesting thing about my family. So my cousin Sam, he's the same age as me. He was diagnosed with ADHD when he was very young, early elementary school. I don't remember the age specifically. And then I was the next person to be diagnosed with ADHD when I was 19. And then many years later, my youngest cousin was diagnosed with ADHD. And she's a girl, so his younger sisters are both girls. And then that made my aunt, their mom, be like, I want to get tested too. And so she was diagnosed in her 50s. And then my other cousin in that family was diagnosed like last year or something. And so 4 out of 5 of them have ADHD, have been diagnosed with ADHD. And all of the women were diagnosed so much later than he was. And then I was like, so obviously this is a piece of the family. And I noticed neurodivergence just in my sex of my parents and my siblings as well. Relating back to signs, I think for me, the most prominent thing is just struggling with my mental health. My identity, just like struggling with depression and suicidal ideation has always been a big problem. Just not really wanting to exist or be an external being. Like I mentioned, that person inside and then the person outside and not feeling like there's a connect there. And so that can be very isolating and confusing. And I guess just a lot of social stress, social anxiety, issues with relationships and maintaining relationships, feeling overwhelmed, shutting down, a lot of fidgeting, needing to do something, right? Like I'm always playing with something, even if it's my hands or whatever. Trouble with eye contact, which I didn't really realize until the pandemic, right? Because I'm hard of hearing. And I learned when I was really young that I lip read, and that's like a big part of communication for me. I have to be able to hear you and see you and like whatever, so I can put the pieces together and understand what you're saying. So when people started wearing masks, I didn't have the option to look at people's mouths anymore. So I was looking at people's eyes and I'm like, this is so uncomfortable. Plus the fact that I'm not getting the visual communication that I'm used to. Yeah. And so now I'm just like, I don't have to make eye contact with people. I don't have to smile at people if I don't want to. And that's been very freeing. But I do still, like, because I am hard of hearing, I do tend to just look at people's lips for the most part, if I can, or make eye contact in short periods of time and then have to take breaks. And yeah, I don't know. There's a lot, but that's all I have for you right now.
Thank you. And just so you know, there's nothing wrong with stimming or regulating yourself. You should never feel bad or feel guilty for that. And your thoughts and feelings are valid. They're your own. For me, I'll just go over briefly how I was diagnosed with autism because it's actually an interesting story. I know I probably have mentioned this to other advocates before, but my mother actually did suspect she didn't know the word autism, but she knew very early on I was very different than other kids. And she took me to 3 different professionals fighting for a diagnosis, but no professional wanted to diagnose me because I was too high functioning. Oh yeah, they said like the worst possible thing to my mother you could ever say to a kid with autism. She'll grow out of it, which we all know is horrible. So yeah. But the reason I got diagnosed with autism was actually for my mother-in-law, believe it or not, and because autism runs in her family, and she immediately knew I was autistic. I don't think I've hid it very well. I definitely have gone through what you have gone through, where you're raised as a girl and you're trained to act. I would say all women are forced to mask to a degree because there's higher expectations on people raised as women very early on. We have to be polite. We have to be controlled. We can't be too emotional. We have to keep everything together. But at the same time, we're considered too emotional when we have a reaction to anything. And we're dismissed so often because of that. Long story short, I ended up getting diagnosed eventually when my mental health from school stress just got to the point where my wife was like, look, you got to go talk to someone. And it wasn't that I didn't want to get diagnosed before. I just did not have the time. After a pretty in-depth questionnaire and a couple of sessions, I was diagnosed. and the psychologist who did diagnose me was like, I knew you were autistic immediately. This is just a formality. So I don't think I've ever masked very well. Like, I always find it very sad and interesting when I hear people talk about that, because I just never did that. Like, I can interact with people pretty, I guess, normally. I don't really like using that word in this context, but I guess on the neurotypical side, that's what it looks like. I can do that in very short bursts. Like I mentioned, like in conversations with people I don't know, I'm actually very interactive with people I don't know because I'm just so bored waiting for something else to happen. But after that, my threshold for social interaction, once it's gone, I have to get out. I am just like, nope. And the thing that stood out most to the psychologist about me was the fact that I had such intense special interests. My obsession with animals was probably one of the highest she had ever seen. And just the fact that I could apply so many different areas of study was pretty interesting to her. I think I might have mentioned this before. If it relates to animals, I can force my brain to learn anything, which is why in my virology class, rabies was the only virus that stuck out to me because it's, I would argue, the most dangerous virus ever, but it's also just how it relates so heavily to animals and humans. Whereas other viruses, it kind of relates a little bit somewhat depending on the species, but other than that, nope.
And having to relate information back to something that you're very familiar with. And for me, I think it's always been like back to myself, right? Have I experienced that before? Do I have a framework for this already that I can pull from to relate it back to? And it's funny that you mentioned that, because when you were mentioning the rate, how you could only focus on rabies, and I was like, oh, it's probably because it's related to animals. But yeah, and I've been trying to explore that, right? Because I'm like, what are my special interests? I know that I do have them, but it's also like when you do have ADHD and depression and stuff, like actually making those interests happen is very hard. And so I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and I'm still exploring that. But I have to have a lot of time and space, right? Like I have to like fully get immersed into it when I want to engage in that type of thing. And I don't have that a lot these days, not when I'm working full time or going to school full time. It's just, there's so many demands happening for me all around that I just don't have time for that. And I don't even think about what it is that I need. I've always relied on social interactions and those connections with people. I think I didn't realize it, but I would always pick friends that were the most like outgoing and not extroverted, and because I would feel comfortable with them, and they would do things and show me how to do things like with confidence and whatever. And so I realized I've always been a very observant person and like needing a person around that I can watch and be able to be like, okay, I'm going to act like them now. And it makes it really hard because you're very sensitive to people's energies. So if I'm living with people, I just suck up their energy right away and I take it on as my own. And that can be really like exhausting, and you're like, I don't even know who I am because I'm always like taking these experiences from other people.
And I feel like this is another unique thing about me specifically compared to a lot of people with autism. I'm very open about my condition and will talk someone's ear off about it. I would almost say autism has become a special interest for me just because I consider it a huge part of my identity now. I'm excited to talk about it and share it. And I don't really like the term educating people because it sounds like I'm talking down to someone, but I like to just talk about it, especially when people have preconceived notions about what autism is and they're like, you don't seem autistic. Yeah. I was like, I was not aware we changed colors or shedded skin. What sets off you talked about this a little bit on and off when we were talking, but what would you say are your biggest triggers in both the work environment and in the classroom for your autism and your ADHD? Like what can cause a meltdown? What causes you stress? What causes you to dissociate? Just stuff like that.
I've definitely been thinking about that a lot this term specifically. It's been a really rough term for me, a lot of space for me to analyze that. And plus, I'm in a lot of classes right now that are asking me to really analyze myself and my identity and my culture, because that is a huge piece in working with other people, as people of all different abilities, races, colors, experiences, is learning and owning your own identity first before exploring and getting into other people's cultures. And yeah, I've had to do a lot of work about that. And I think in school, and that's been hard, right? Because how do you ask for accommodations when they're a little bit iffy sometimes? But I just need a lot of connection to some degree. If I feel disconnected from the content or the people teaching me the content, if I'm not getting regular feedback about things, it can really make me feel stressed because I don't have a lot of energy to give. Being asked in a school context is really a lot more than I have. And so I think not having that, like, why is this important? Getting direct feedback all the time can make me just feel like it's not worth my energy. What's the point? Even though in the broader context, I do understand the point, but I think just having support and having people that relate to my experiences and being able to talk through that, because I think a big piece for me is I don't often know what I need if I haven't had that experience of being given it before. And I think sometimes you have to be creative. I don't know. School is a very here's what it looks like. Here's what you're supposed to do as a student. I definitely am not that person, right? I need to work at my own pace because my energy and my focus shifts all over the place. So I have to be able to engage in the content when I have the capacity to engage in it and not just when things are due. So I need a lot of flexibility in that way, and time and structure and knowing what to expect. I definitely for that all the time for teachers. What's going to happen today? Here's a little bit of a timeline. First, you're going to discuss this, and then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to discuss this, because without that, I can feel very lost.
For me, what can trigger a meltdown with me, in fact, I almost had a meltdown in anatomy lab this term. It was actually bad. So first of all, I have really specific sound sensitivities, and I know I've mentioned this before, and I've mentioned this every term to teachers. If there is a fire drill, just let me know so I cannot be in the building. I cannot stand those fire alarms. Those are really physically painful.
Yeah.
I would be in the fetal position just covering my ears in elementary school and middle school because they don't tell you when those stupid things go off for whatever reason. And I think high school, I managed to hide it a little bit. I think that's my only prominent masking. But even then, I don't think I hid it very well because teachers would just ask me if I was okay. And because I didn't have the autism diagnosis, they would just, every single one of them just said, it's just only for a few minutes, you're overreacting. I'm like, no, this is physically painful. It's physically painful. I've described it as in the past as drilling into different parts of your skull and your body. At least that's what it feels like to me. But anyway, so smoke detectors do the same thing to me too. And in terms of classwork, it drives me nuts when there's no structure with assignments or expectations. Anatomy lab was like that too. First of all, my lab TA was actually super nice, and so was the professor. But the problem was, because it's an exploratory lab, they're just figure out what you need to do for your assignments and your report. And there's no lab report either. So I don't specifically know what they want me to do. And there's no worksheet to fill out, even though they wanted us to identify all these muscles, these organs. And I'm like, fine, but if there's no accountability and there's no lab report, there's no reason for me to do that. But the thing that set me off really in anatomy lab, or at least almost, was, so my partner and I got a dogfish shark to dissect, which I really wanted. I really wanted the dogfish shark. You either got the mink or the dogfish shark, and oh my God, I was so excited for that shark. The problem with sharks, they are really hard to skin. Their skin, it's not like a mink where you just peel it off like Velcro. No, sharks, they're super glued on there. It's cartilaginous layer, so they're super attached to the muscles. I looked at my TA and I'm like, and the dogfish shark were supposed to be skinned before we got them, but there was some kind of miscommunication that caused them not to be skinned. And I looked at my lab TA and I was like, there is no way we're going to have time to identify all the muscles you want to on this shark. And she was like, oh no, it'll be fine. And no, it was not. And I later learned she had never even skinned these things before, so she had no idea how long it would take us. And I was really mad. I was super pissed. I was on a borderline meltdown that day because I was like, oh my God, we're not going to get this done. We're losing a whole lab period to this. I was just pacing around lab, and I feel like I'm very animated compared to a lot of people in lab. I'm very high stress to be around, so I feel bad for my lab partners who have had me in the past.
I can very much relate to that. Not having communication or finding things out later that weren't built into the original expectations. That does not work for me whatsoever. It makes me extremely stressed.
Yeah, so that was fun. But it was fine the rest of the term, and my issue with that is just I got really bored in anatomy lab a lot of times because we got our work done so fast otherwise. That being said, it was really cool to finally cut into the shark. And we actually had this female shark that had 2 full uteri full of yolk. And the other group with the dogfish shark actually had babies.
Wow, that would be cool to see.
What do you want employers and instructors to keep in mind about not only your autism and ADHD, but also just both of these conditions in general?
My experience a lot is always feeling I don't want to take up too much space or feeling like a bother, right? That's always been a big thing for me, is not feeling like I deserve people to consider me or accommodate me in any way. And so I think it can be hard to think about it that way sometimes. How would I want people to treat me or anybody else with this experience? And I think that's really why I got into advocacy too, is because I have a tendency to be I need to ask for what I need, but I know it'll benefit other people. I've ended up in a lot of managerial positions at jobs because of that. I feel I need more structure in this way. And us not having a structure for something makes all these miscommunications happen. And I really hate it. Really bothers me. right? So then I create this system and then everybody starts following it and it makes things run a little bit smoother. So I think that like systems thinking, and I've actually learned that too about people on the spectrum. They tend to be like a more of a leader or manager type because they think about things a little bit differently. I guess it would be just like if someone discloses anything to you as a teacher or an employer, to like not discredit it. In my opinion, anybody that is far from neurotypical is way better to be around. They're more fun, more interesting. They have a better perspective to offer, different ways of thinking about things, creative. You often can't have those conversations or feel safe having those conversations about disclosing your disabilities with people because of the way that they might think about it or think that you're like trying to get away with things or something. But to just have that open conversation and ask questions and clarify, because people, if they're willing to share, they will share. Then we should communicate that, right? That I'm not feeling like I have the capacity to share this with you today or whatever. But yeah, don't be afraid to ask questions either, because I think the more we don't know about differences in living, the like less likely we are to open our minds and try different things and ways of interacting with people. Sometimes you just need to be exposed to a traditional systems way, doing a little differently and being like, that's cool, that's what I need.
What I would say is, especially because I openly disclose every term to my professors, if you have questions, just ask. Don't make assumptions. Don't, whatever TV show you've watched, whatever documentaries you've watched, just ask us. We're right here.
Right.
And it's interesting whenever I do disclose to professors because I can get a gauge of how the class is going to be pretty quickly throughout the term. Usually if a standard like, thank you for telling me email, it's either going to be just average or pretty bad. But if the professor is really communicative to you and asks you questions and wants to actually genuinely help you and accommodate you, that's going to be a really good class. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but it does mean it's going to be a good teacher who cares about their students. And that's been consistent across the board. I've never been wrong about that. And that's been very interesting. And another thing I would say is don't get frustrated with us. We have a different way of thinking, as you said, and we're either going to be faster or slower. It just depends on how our brains are wired. But that doesn't mean we're not as good as your other students. It just means that we're going to approach things differently.
And like for myself, based on a whole range of things, like my energy and my brain function are so variable throughout the day, or like what happens, right? If sensitivity happens like in the midst of class or whatever, and I can't calm down, then like I won't be focused on the class for the rest of the day or things like that. So just being able to be flexible and just not like necessarily scolding people for being like sending a message being like, please don't call on me. Like I don't have the capacity to answer right now. I'm like freaking out internally, and then respecting that.
Another thing I would say is a lot of teachers fall into this trap, and I know I've told this story before, but my general chemistry 3 professor, very nice woman, definitely knew her stuff, excellent chemist. She cannot teach worth crap, I'm sorry. But anyways, there was this problem. We were studying kinetics one day, and there was this huge problem. She split up different parts between different groups in the class, and I repeatedly asked her, hey, can you help me with this? I don't understand how you explain this. Can you walk me through a different example? And she just said, look at it long enough that the answer will come to you. And she just kept repeating herself. And so when it came to me and my group member, finally, she just kept staring. And I'm like, I asked you repeatedly for help. I didn't know how to do it then. I'm not going to know how to do it now. I swear to you, it was like this staring contest for 20 minutes. And like 20 minutes of our 50-minute lecture was wasted on this. So I was pretty pissed.
Yeah.
And in my reaction, I just get angry and defiant and fight. Like my reaction is to fight. It's not to freeze or flee. I feel like that's gotten me into trouble a lot as a kid, actually. Mm-hmm. But I point blank told her the answer is not going to magically appear in my head. You can stare all you want. It's not going to happen. So eventually my partner just ended up solving the part for us. And I almost dropped the class. I was so upset that day because I was just so angry.
Yeah. And you had disclosed before, right? About autism?
At that time, actually, I didn't know diagnosed with autism, so she didn't know that and I didn't know that. So it's not that she ignored my needs there, but it's also the fact that she did not pay attention to what I was saying. She didn't believe me. And I actually did talk to her about this later. I actually did confront her about this years later, a little after I became an advocate, actually. Mm. And she was very apologetic. She actually didn't deny what she did. She actually took the time to meet with me and talk about what happened. And she also explained that I was a very smart student, so she thought if she gave me enough time, the answer would eventually come to me and I'd solve it. So to her, she was helping me by pushing me. And that is a really bad, toxic mindset to have, in my opinion, as for instructors, because you're making a lot of assumptions on how your student's brain works, like what you're saying, energy levels that day. And especially if they're openly telling you that they don't know how to do something, you're expecting them to somehow magically know how to do it.
They think you're just being lazy. You don't want to put the mental effort into this right now. But no, I'm actually asking you for a different way to get this information because that's how I learn. I need to see a couple examples or something. Yeah.
Like another experience I had was actually in a physics class. And this time I actually did have my diagnosis, but it was a sub that did this, not like the actual physics teacher, just for context. So she was explaining this concept in a way that I didn't understand. So I asked her to do it a different way. And I kid you not, she said, "This is physics too. You should know how to do this." I called her out. Like after that, I was like not having that at all. Like I do not put up with that from professors at all now. I'm not sure if it's because of my age or the fact that I have my diagnosis, but I do not tolerate that anymore. I don't tolerate that from employers. I don't tolerate that from instructors. I'm not saying that you should handle your situation any differently than you do, but I think
that's great. And that's a skill I'm trying to develop. I actually had a teacher recently who was like, you need to call people out when you need to question whatever they're doing. And I was like, you're absolutely right. And I think a lot of times it's like, oh, you need to have those conversations in private. But no, I think you really do need to stand up and be like, what you're saying is wrong in front of other people, because how else are other people going to learn? You know what I mean? And another thing I mentioned too is that pops into my brain when you're talking about your professors was office hours are super important to me, having the space to be able to engage in the content with someone who's teaching it to me so I can know really like the motivation behind it, the connection behind it, the broader whatever. And as much as I love like office hours being like appointment or whatever, I think not having that anymore. I feel like it changed after COVID. If a professor is like required to have office hours and they're at this time every week at the same time, and cool. I know when to expect that. I can show up when I need it. But making appointments is so exhausting for me that I often just don't ever show up. If it's a drop-in thing or if you have to make an appointment, right? I just can't filter all those demands and making that happen. So then I just don't take that and what I need. So I have asked that from certain teachers. Can we schedule office hours at the start of the term bi-weekly? And then I'll just send you an email ahead of time if I'm not going to show up. Some teachers have been great about that. Others haven't. But having the space to explain your experience in the class and when engaging with the teacher, I also think it's helpful for them to get that perspective of students' brains work differently. And when you give them the time and space to understand the content with them, it means so much in the broader context.
Do you often choose to disclose to your employers and your instructors about your ADHD and autism, or do you choose not to? Why or why not? Because that's like a really interesting contrast I see a lot with people with autism.
It depends, honestly. It depends on the teacher. It depends on the vibe I get from them. I've never really disclosed in at work situations in the past. I honestly think I worked in food service for a reason because it really helped my ADHD for some reason. Like I could engage in so many different things in a fast-paced way and not lose interest. I was constantly being stimulated and became good at that. So then that gave me dopamine. So I think I thrived in those environments in terms of my neurodivergence. But in terms of other disabilities, like hard of hearing, whenever I've tried to ask to be accommodated in a workplace setting, it has never been met with open mind or, I'll take that into consideration. And then in terms of school, since I started going back to school 2 years ago, I've been very open with figuring out what that line is. Do I want to disclose? How much do I need to disclose? I think in general, just having accommodations through disability allows me the space to be like, I have disabilities. Here are the things I'm going to ask for. And then I'm going to keep an open dialogue with you if things are working or not working, or if I need something more. But I don't always say specifically what it is. I don't think that always needs to be shared. At this point now in my program, though, I am have the same 5-6 teachers who will just continue to be my instructors. So I think in that way, I will it depends on the conversation we're having, but I will share things about my experience. And then you learn a little bit about your instructors too. And you're like, oh, I didn't realize that about you. And it makes you connect in a different way. It's interesting about the hearing. I've been met with that a lot is people, I don't know how, because like I said, I haven't disclosed a lot about ADHD, autism in a lot of spaces, but when it comes to hearing, people just, I don't know, they just brush it off. don't know what to do about it.
Would you say that your hearing helps your autism and ADHD sensory issue or goes against it? Because sometimes, and because I mentioned the sound thing with me, like those specific sounds with the fire alarm and the smoke detectors are really painful for me. And I'm not sure if certain sounds are painful for you, but would you say your hearing helps you or doesn't help you? Because does your hearing also cause things to be understimulated for you?
That's a great question. And I was thinking about that earlier when you mentioned that about the alarm. It's almost like a deaf gain sort of thing to some degree, but also, I don't know, it's a little bit in both worlds, just like everything in my life. But so without my hearing aids, things are pretty dull. Like I have a moderate loss on my left side, a severe loss on my right side. So I still hear, it's not very coherent. It's just noises. I have to have like cues to put them together, visual cues. So in that way, if I just turn my hearing aids off, they act as earplugs plus my like just normal baseline hearing. Because if I take them out, there's a little bit more eardrum stimulation. So that's cool if I am experiencing something that's like, because hearing aids also it took me about a decade to finally get used to the constant stimulation. There's always this sort of ambient noise to some degree with that energy going into your body. When you're wearing hearing aids and when you take them out, it's just immediately whoosh and like a calm feeling because you're not having, and you don't realize it, so you take them out. So I think that took me a really long time to adjust to, is like the overstimulation from sounds that I wasn't used to hearing. Like I hated them when I first got them, and that's why I never wanted them in the first place. Like my voice was so loud, like my feet walking on the ground was loud, my hair was loud. As I'm sitting here now, they creak, right? They creak a lot. So like I'm wearing headphones because I have to wear them over my hearing aids to be able to connect to my computer. I'm wearing a beanie, which I always am, and glasses. So it's just like constant noise. And so it did take me a long time to be able to filter out that. And then even without my hearing aids, there's some sounds, especially in the frequencies that I have more access to, that just really drive me. And I don't know if I've ever gotten in a fetal position on the ground, but I can relate to the experience of it sounds like drills. There's certain people's voices that really, especially with hearing aids, really great, and I just can't stand it. Or if people are too soft-spoken, I don't even pay attention to them anymore. Like you mentioned about the conversations and not being able to engage in the content. Yes, true for me. But also if I can't hear someone, I'm just not even going to give them my attention. It's subconscious these days. Instead of asking people to speak up, I would just be like, or just pretend I'm listening to them, but I'm really off there thinking about something else. So yeah, it's interesting. And I'm also like, I do feel like I have auditory processing problems. Plus, I'm hard of hearing, so yeah, it's just a very interesting experience.
I just want to say I want to commend you for what you do on a daily basis, because as you were talking, it just occurred to me. Every time we've interacted, you accommodate me by wearing your hearing aids and your headphones because I can't sign. So thank you very much for that, and I'm very sorry you have to do that.
Thank you for acknowledging that. I think people don't think about that a lot, right? I had someone in middle school tell me like, oh, you must be so exhausted from listening all the time. And I was like, you know what? You're right. I do take 3-hour naps when I go home. And I think that's also undiagnosed autism and ADHD as well. But I realized I think I was managed a lot more when I was a child because I had to be forced to pay attention or else I wouldn't hear what was going on, right? I was forced to pay attention, and then around the time I got hearing aids is around the time that I started struggling with things. I think it messed with my identity as a person that was hard of hearing and considered disabled, but now I just feel like I'm more part of the hearing world because I have accommodated to them. And yeah, so now I don't necessarily have to pay attention as much. And maybe that's why a lot of things started popping up with me in the ADHD aspect to some degree, because now I'm like, I don't have to pay attention as much. So what am I going to do with myself? So that's an interesting correlation. As an autistic person, I've grown up in this one experience, and that's my experience, right? I'm hearing, I speak, I hear. Is the culture that I was raised in. I was not raised in deaf culture. I did not know sign language. And so it is really hard for me to adapt to that change because what I'm hearing is familiar. What this is new. And while I do go to deaf events and I'm just like so fascinated, and I'm like just so engaging with deaf people, and I just feel different than when I communicate with hearing people. But it's just really anxiety provoking also because like my identity is like, I don't feel a part of either world. Like I have to accommodate too much to hearing people in this world, but I'm not deaf enough or whatever to be considered worthy in that space. So it is a weird dance, and I'm just trying to keep light and open and no expectations as I go forward. I'm just going to be myself and learn from my mistakes and hopefully find some community somewhere one day. But learning about autism too has also allowed me to ask for accommodations more and be like, if we're having a meeting, I need you to enable captions, because while I don't always use them, it is nice to have them to follow along with every now and then, and just getting better about asking people what I need instead of just, so it's so easy for me to just be like, nod along and pretend that I know what's going on, or I can hear what people are saying. And I get enough information where I can engage, but then I leave feeling like, wow, I really don't know what to take away from that, because I really was not like myself in that interaction. So interesting.
I also want to give you credit for accommodating the deaf people in the deaf community whenever you communicated with them, because you're obviously signing in that situation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's another layer to your situation that I think you deserve all the credit in the world for that. Just not just a lot, but all of it.
Yeah.
Because you're accommodating literally two different worlds when you communicate. So that's actually pretty amazing to me.
Yeah.
And the fact that you're able to do that so well.
It's easy to feel guilty because you're like, I know my signing skills aren't great, but it's hard to learn a language when you get older, especially when you have memory and cognitive issues. But I determined to keep going because I am hard of hearing and I could lose all my hearing one day. And if I could already have a job in a community, which I know and I'm immersed in, and a language that I know, then I won't have to adapt when that happens. I will just already be in a world that is set up for me, which is pretty cool.
And relating to your identity, I don't know, I'm obviously not a part of the deaf community in any way, shape, or form, but I would say I don't think you have to be deaf enough or hard of hearing enough to be a part of a community. To me, if you can sign and build a community for yourself with whoever you connect with, I don't think you have to feel guilty for that.
Yeah.
At least that's my take on that. That's
just a personal struggle for me in general, is just feeling guilty and not feeling worthy of identities, spaces, and communities. And I know that's not necessarily true. It's always been a thing that has been a part of my mental dialogue. And so learning to let go of that is definitely what I'm trying to do.
I don't want to bring up toxic advocacy in this conversation because that's a separate podcast, but I'm just thinking of that one advocate who I think I mentioned this to you, where it was like we were coming up with ideas to do. I don't forget what exactly the event was, but I think my idea was like having a community where people of lower income can learn sign language for their deaf or hard of hearing relatives. And it was just meant to be like, my idea was like, what I had it in my head was like this community event for free. And this other advocate is, you're profiting off of the deaf community or you're appropriating it. And I'm like, what? How am I doing that? And first of all, you can't gatekeep a language like that. It only takes one generation for a language to die, first of all. So that's really counterproductive what you're saying. And wouldn't we want to have more sign language, more people who speak sign language or sign language? I'm actually not sure how to appropriately describe sign language. I apologize. But
I just say use sign language. Yeah.
My point is, wouldn't we want to increase the number of people who know how to use sign language? The deaf community and hard of hearing community could actually engage and communicate with the wider population. I feel like, I don't know, I'm not trying to like divert the conversation too much, but I always have found that extremely weird that people who aren't even in different advocacy spaces, who don't even have the conditions they have, want to gatekeep the community itself. And I just think that's extremely toxic.
Yeah, and I was like, I'm not part of the deaf community necessarily. I'm not deaf. I'm hard of hearing, and I was raised as a hearing, so I don't also feel like I have the right or the space to advocate on their behalf, right? I only have my experience as a hard of hearing person and how I grew up to pull from in terms of that. And I totally wish that I had gotten an opportunity to learn sign language way earlier on. It was just never a part of the conversation in terms of the medical field, it being diagnosed with hearing loss, like working with audiologists and going to those appointments every 6 months. Like, it was just never a part of the conversation that's so common in like the medical model of hearing. And I think about that a lot. If I would have started learning sign language when I was younger, things would just be a lot easier. And I feel like I would have had a more opportunity to connect with people over the years instead of just feeling isolated. Yeah, so I'm all for supporting deaf people in teaching a wide variety of people, sign language. Yeah, it is hard. I can't speak to what the deaf community wants because I'm not deaf myself. And as long as you're learning from people that are deaf and they are being paid or offering their time and they want to teach it to people who want to learn, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think Yeah, I think exposure is the biggest thing. It's like some people don't know what they're missing out on. That's always been my experience. I don't know what I'm missing out on until I'm given an opportunity to see it in a different light. Like even with injuries, like I didn't realize how bad I had an ankle injury once until they put me in a boot and I could walk for the first time in 2 months. It's a very similar experience to that. You often don't know what you're missing out on until you find out what it's like to be included or have access to something. So the more resources, the better.
And another thing I wanted to say, and the reason I brought that up in this conversation is just because I've experienced a lot of gatekeeping with autism advocacy myself from people who aren't even a part of the autistic community. Like toxic advocacy, basically someone gets so attached to being your hero and your advocate that they think they're doing the right thing by you, but they don't actually talk to you about what you actually need or want from a situation. Like what you described just reminds me a lot of what I've experienced too with people who think they're doing the right thing by the autistic community, but they're really not, and they're really just making things worse. What happens is people who have autistic relatives or people who are deaf or hard of hearing or really any disability, they just get so attached to being their hero and their advocate, they end up speaking over them, I think is what happens a lot of times.
For sure,
I don't know if your experience, but that was definitely my experience with my mom, and she just ended, I didn't have a diagnosis, but she just wanted to fight my battles all the time, and I would just get so frustrated with her because a lot of times she just missed the point of what I even needed. Out of curiosity, what is your experience with that, if you don't mind me asking, both as an autistic person, ADHD person, and someone who's hard of hearing?
Here's a couple things that popped into my head. I feel that way a lot with my family, like my mom and my sister. They're always like, I'm here for you. This is more related to just my experience in general with mental health, but I'm always here for you. You hear that a lot. Let me know if you need anything whatsoever, like I'll be there for you. And then you eventually ask for what you need and it's not met with. And it ends up being very like almost traumatic experience to some degree. Like you finally ask for what you need and then it's like this horrible experience. Oh my gosh, you're so selfish or whatever. Why would I do that for you? That's not just in my family. And maybe I put that on people, right? Like it's become like what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. Projection. Like you project these expectations for reactions on the people based on previous reactions. So then you don't want to ask for help or what you need. Interestingly enough, I feel like I can never go to places alone sometimes. I think because I feel like I need like emotional support, but also especially with COVID, like I would just always prefer to go with someone because I couldn't ever hear anybody with people wearing masks. So I would just be like, what did they say? And they'd be like my translators to some degree instead of asking people to like try and communicate with me in a different way. I think being raised as hearing, you just learn that asking people to communicate with you differently is never usually met in the same experience, never met with a good experience, especially when you say you're hard of hearing. That's a lot of, oh yeah, me too. Like I struggle to hear too. But in reality, most of the time, those things have a normal level of hearing, so they don't actually know. There was this experience I had in college where I had like maybe 6 or so people in my room or someone else's room when I lived in the dorm. And my set of hearing aids at the time came with this tube thing that you like put on the earpiece of the receiver and then the other piece goes into like your ear. It's made for parents, like so they can check the sound quality of their kids' hearing aids. But I like let everybody in that room, like I turned on the hearing aid for them so they could experience a little bit of what that was like. We like going from silent to being turned on and the little jingle that happens when they get turned on to like then what happens afterwards. And every single person's reactions really surprised me. They were just like, oh my God, that's awful. Like, how do you deal with that all day? And I was like, oh my gosh, you're right. I don't know. I didn't realize because you adapt to things. But then people immediately forget about it and they don't think about the fact that I've asked them a million times to walk on my left side because that's my good side, or remember to look at me when they're talking and stuff like that. It's hard when anything is invisible or like people can't see it to the eye to forget. And so that's why I think talking about things and reminding people and just speaking up for yourself more often in general when you're dealing with something, it's a good skill to learn in life.
But again, I just want to say tremendous respect for you, just what you go through and just what you have to do to accommodate people just for basic communication. I can't promise I'll be perfect with you every time, obviously, but I promise you I'm never going to forget that.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, it's always So, like, it's so giddy when I realize when someone does something, like they do walk on the left side of me because they remembered or something. I'm like, oh my gosh, so weird that you remembered that. But it's funny.
If we ever hang out in person, you're going to have to remind me of that, because just because I'm not interacting with you on a constant basis, I'm just going to forget that. But it's not because I'm trying to. It's just that my brain is just inconvenient sometimes. It's the autism thing. I swear it takes me, like, seriously, I can interact with someone for a whole month and I'm not going to remember their name.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've become so horrible with names over the last decade that I just always ask people. I'm like, I know I've seen you before, but I do not remember your name. And sometimes it happens like 30 minutes into the conversation. And I like can't engage in a conversation because all I'm thinking about is like, what is your name? And I'm like, you just have to ask. It's funny. I don't know.
Would you say that your gender was one of the biggest barriers to getting your diagnosis with your ADHD and probably in the future your autism as well? Or would you say that there were other barriers, and what other barriers can you think of that were involved?
I say definitely. I feel like that's a huge piece. I was assigned female at birth. That's how I was socialized and raised as a female. I have questioned my gender and that since I was like 3. I've always had this conversation of like, why does it matter if I'm male or female or whatever? Can't I just be this person that exists that doesn't have a label? Or as you go older, and especially going through puberty and like fully accepting that, hey, my body's changing, like I actually am like a female. I say that with quotation marks because that's just a body, right? It's a body that I have to live with. But I don't know if it was us that talked about this earlier. I think in general, women are asked to mask a lot more, to assimilate, to accommodate, to not take up too much space. I think if you mix that along with however you're raised as a family, like my family had very traditional roles, like gender roles, and the women, they get married early and they have babies early and they have families. And that's what normal looks like to them and what they expect. It's really, and then, like I said, once you go through puberty, okay, so I'm like this woman now and I have to ascribe to these roles that people expect of me, because that's just how I seemed to survive, was by doing what was people expected of me or what I thought they expected of me. And then when I really started thinking about it in later years and like learning more about gender expression, gender identity, I was like, okay, I think I can finally feel comfortable saying that this is my experience. But I think that's probably a huge reason why females are typically not diagnosed earlier on. And the emotional thing too. You're being too sensitive. And maybe I just am a sensitive person. Like I've always been very sensitive in terms of like smells and clothes and whatever.
Yeah, no, that answers it pretty well. And the autism and ADHD studies were actually done on boys originally, specifically white boys. I want to say like elementary school age, maybe up to middle school, but I don't think it was even that old. That's why it took so long for the professional mental health community to finally get it in their heads that girls and people raised as women or in girls have ADHD and autism too. And it doesn't have to be so severe on the spectrum. And I don't even think autism and ADHD are really that rare at all in either gender or any gender, honestly. It's more like we're getting a wider awareness of it and a wider awareness of it now just with the internet, and to a degree, media does help with awareness with autism and ADHD, but I hate the way they're portrayed a lot of times because a lot of times it's very inaccurate or just in one specific like that very narrow scope that just to me does not help.
Yeah. I was talking about that recently about like social media, like TikTok and Instagram Reels. They're a very like high dopamine thing because you get a lot of information in a visual way very quickly. And I think, so what's the harm in saying I related to this content? I think that this is something to explore for me, because I'd never been exposed to information in a way that I couldn't engage with and actually understand it instead of reading a long article or whatever. So I've always thought that was really interesting. Of our very like high dopamine, high reward modern society, and Divergent is a neurodevelopmental thing. So it happens when you're a kid and how your brain develops. And then it's nothing that can be cured. It's just like something that you have to learn to live with, and people need more awareness about, because it is very common and it's going to keep continuing to be common because I don't know.
Another thing I would say is it goes into even the culture of each family itself, because with my family, autism was never brought up because they didn't know autism existed. Other families, there's such huge stigmas against mental health that even slight deviations from the normal or whatever you want to call it, they don't want their children to be diagnosed. They don't want to have this label, which to me is very toxic, because if you don't have a label, you're not going to get your needs met. You're not going to know how to talk about it. You're not going to know how to vocalize it. And that was my biggest problem for the longest time
Mm-hmm.
And that was something else that the mental health professionals told my mom when I was a kid. We don't want to put a label on her. She'll probably grow out of it. And I'm like, I want to define these people and just yell at them. You screwed me over my entire childhood. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, it's hard not to ruminate about that, right? If this one thing would have been done differently so long ago, like how would my life look now? You know what I mean? Isn't it funny how everything in the quote normal space to be compared to is of a white male? Like, it just makes everything so hard. Like, that studies are not diverse enough with anything, and it's just really fascinating to learn about.
I actually find it depressing because I've actually done a lot of research about the foundational studies of autism and not really ADHD so much. So I'm not going to comment too much on that, but it was very similar.
Yeah.
And basically the gist of it is it was white boys with specific privileges that researchers had access to. That it's just what it was at the time. And girls and real people raised as girls were just dismissed just automatically, and people of color were barely considered even human. I don't care what people say. To me, really recently, like 1970s, I'm sorry. I feel like
it's absolutely true.
I don't care what the textbooks say. Racism is still alive and well and still reflected in our school systems. And I've talked to several people of color at this point about this too, and they are like, yeah, I have autism and ADHD, but I was like the bad kid or something like that. And I actually remember in school, there was this Hispanic kid in 4th grade where I felt so bad for him, even though he was like one of the people who bullied me the worst. And I felt bad for him because my teacher would put him in the back and then have his desk actually face the hallway. I remember that so well because I saw it every day for 5 days a week for 9 months. I can't forget that. Yeah. And I would just feel so bad. And the way racism was taught when I was a kid in the 90s was that it happened specifically between white and black people, and other races just weren't even discussed. Like Hispanic weren't discussed, Indian weren't discussed, no one from the Middle East was discussed, and Native Americans obviously weren't discussed. I mean, unless if we're talking about in the context of Thanksgiving, which was presented in a Disney-esque fashion, which was horribly inaccurate on all levels. And that's why I want to have these conversations and just how to change them. Yeah, we have these studies. We can talk about them and use them in some way, but we need to also talk about how wrong they were and how they set us up for failure.
Definitely. I think I ruminate a lot about what I learned as a kid in school about certain topics and certain things. And it was all just so wrong, right? And I think that's very destabilizing as an adult because we just need to be teaching kids from a young age, just including everybody, because yes, racism, ableism, all of the isms are very alive and well, and they're always going to keep changing unless we interrupt them. Just one quick little closing thing, interesting experience. My sister's a teacher and their school is very inclusive. So any with learning challenges, behavior challenges, whatever, they're all in the same classroom together, which I was like, I wish we always had that. But she was saying that it's really hard because a lot of the high support kiddos don't get the support they need because they're not staffed well enough. And so then it just becomes really stressful for everybody. And I was like, oh, that sucks. There's something that's being framed in a positive light, like having this inclusive environment, but not staffing or having enough teachers to really support it and make it a successful experience for everybody. And so I think that's where a big focus is needed, making sure that we're employing people to do these jobs and not adding too much work onto people that are already overstressed, because nothing's ever going to happen if you do it that way.
So thank you very much for sharing your experiences today, Mackenzie. I hope this podcast was as enlightening as it was for me, because I feel like I actually learned quite a lot from you just with you talking about your hard of hearing and just how it plays into your autism and your ADHD. And again, I have tremendous respect. I really feel whoever listens to this podcast, I feel like everyone owes you a lot of respect for that, like tremendous respect.
I appreciate that. Thanks for getting this started.
Thank you for listening through today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed hearing Mackenzie's story as much as I did. One thing to take away from this conversation is how two different people with autism experience this condition. Mackenzie and I highlighted many aspects of our autism and Mackenzie's ADHD, including how we both feel exhausted and energized by various levels of stimulation.
This episode was produced by Let's Talk Podcast Collective as a collaborative effort between students, the Accessible Education and Disability Resources Department, and the PCC Multimedia Department. We air new episodes bi-weekly on our home website, our Spotify channel, and on X-Ray 91.1 FM and 107.1 FM.